Hello, my name is Leanne Riman, and today we are going to be discussing the conflict in the United States during World War II for my History 1378 course, Section Assignment 3. Specifically, we will be looking at the conflicts that three different ethnic groups had during this time. This includes the Jewish refugee crisis, the African American civil rights, and the ethnic Mexican agricultural workers, and how they all had to overcome adversity and try to give themselves a better life. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 incited the involvement of America in World War II. America was forced into fighting for what was right. We wanted to fight for the people and fight for democracy. We wanted to end the fascism and totalitarianism that was planning on taking over. The U.S. was going to fight to call an end to these practices that would potentially oppress the American population. Hitler, Mussolini, and Toho all put their countries under turmoil, and America was working to defeat this. A big issue many ethnic groups had during this time was to try and seek shelter and safety for themselves. Many were looking to come to America for better lives and to ensure their freedom. However, freedom and happiness was really hard to find when the United States was solely concerned with taking down these powers. They were less concerned about immigrants and ethnic groups and more concerned with their image and what they were going to bring for their citizens in the future. Americans used wartime propaganda to influence Americans to fight in the war. The key was to give Americans the idea that involvement in the war would bring unity, harmony, and peace in the future. These wartime propaganda posters incorporated the idea of involvement. The idea was, if everyone got involved and did their part, we could push through as a nation. We can see that in this piece that says, I want you for U.S. Army. It's saying everyone needs to get involved, the politicians want us to get involved, and we need complete and full effort from the citizens. Not all propaganda pieces were trying to influence Americans to enlist in the war. They needed help in other areas as well. For example, funding the war. So this propaganda piece, Keep Him Flying, Buy War Bonds, was influencing Americans to spend their money to bring victory to the men in battle and for the country. However, the conflict for different ethnic groups living and moving into America during the war was that it wasn't so easy to get involved or succeed for themselves or for this country. The Jewish refugee crisis included an unfair treatment of Jews, from a quarter of Jewish people dying in the Holocaust to several hundreds of thousands being mistreated when trying to flee to America. Americans were concerned that Nazi spies were trying to come to our land. In June of 1939, the German boat St. Louis and nearly 1,000 passengers were all turned away from the Miami port, forcing the ship to return to Europe. More than a quarter died in the Holocaust. That's insane. By 1938, there were 125,000 applications for visas to come to Americans, and most were coming from Germany and annexed territories of Austria. The U.S. quotas for these immigrants was 27,000. The refugee crisis just got worse, and immigration restrictions got tighter. No one in America knew the Holocaust was occurring and the oppression Jewish people faced. Roosevelt himself thought many were spies for the Nazis, and in February of 1942, 2 months after the attack at Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed an executive order that permitted the government to take every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage. Americans could not trust these people and did not even know that Nazis were carrying out such a mass murder. They claimed that the planned murder of 2 million European Jews was merely a war rumor. Shown in this poster, it's describing things that Hitler wanted us to believe to make us think that he was going to be able to take over, and we did not want that to happen at all. Just like it said here, we decided that Americans will not be fooled. The previous poster Hitler wants us to believe, instills a set of characteristics that brings the need to have fear and distrust towards the Jewish immigrants, but America would not fall for it. It was not prevalent to Americans until 1944 in the photos and newspaper reports that demonstrated the mass murder of Jews. Even then, Americans didn't fully trust all Jewish refugees. When the government realized they failed to step in and rescue Jews from Hitler, they realized they needed to act fast. President Roosevelt signed an executive order on January 22nd of 1944 to allow Jews to escape to America. This was when the War Refugee Board was created. However, a lot of notions towards Jews were derogatory after the war because Americans were fighting for their families, to find jobs, and to make ends meet. There was even a poster, Jews, Jews, Jews everywhere, showcasing the next stage of oppression the Jews faced. This is because during the post-war economic crisis in the US, people were frustrated that they could not find work themselves, so they thought that Jews were just invading on their space and their jobs. This caused them to despise anyone that came in and took their jobs. It caused a lot of hardships for the Jewish refugees. There was anti-Semitism taking place in America as well. This caused Jews to feel unaccepted and without much opportunity in their new place either. There was a lot of pressure on the Jews and America as well. A quote from Senator Robert Wagner says, "Because of the developments in Palestine, a maximum number of refugees have been made homeless by the cruel oppression known in history." A lot of Jews didn't really have an option of where to go. They had family, friends, people in their communities that passed away in these concentration camps. They needed to go somewhere where they could emotionally, physically, and economically heal. More than 80,000 Jewish refugees came to America between 1945 and 1952. However, they could not see what they unsaw, or even put into words what they went through. Elie Wiesel wrote a book called Night that described the horrendous things he saw that he cannot unsee. This is just one person that faced this much oppression, but there were so many more people, a mass body of people that faced this. So you could only imagine the conflict that Jews were going through during this time period. In 1941, African Americans wanted to stand up and fight to be treated equally in this country, to be hired equally, treated equally within the workplace, and receive equal pay and benefits. A big problem that African Americans had was lynching. Lynching had been recorded to be entering a new and altogether dangerous phase, in which Black people are being accused of crimes, real or alleged. Next, white men will seize their victim and kill them. Sometimes they are taken quietly and without being put in the general eye of the public. It's just like they vanish. African Americans want justice for this. It should have no longer been allowed. African Americans rightfully wanted to prevent lynching and other crimes against them from going underground and without punishment. Only 5 occurrences of lynching had been reported in 1940, but there were several more occurring behind closed doors. The anti-lynching bill was extremely important if African Americans were going to receive the equality that they deserved and that was so important to them. African Americans are rightly furious, and what is really happening isn't enlisted in stats. The government isn't looking at it. A lot of times the truth seems to be going unnoticed for them. It's caused a lot of resentment for these people. They're frustrated. Politicians aren't seeing their side of the story. They're only looking at a piece of paper rather than the truth of the matter. This can be extremely frustrating when you are of another ethnic group and had to fight alongside other Americans in this war just to be treated less than you are as a person. These facts come from the NAACP papers and also showcase that even though the government was working to pass legislation and end the discriminatory ways, African Americans were still being discriminated against. Throughout World War II, the U.S. Army remained segregated by race. The NAACP had a campaign called V campaign, advocating victory against fascism across the world and victory against racism on the home front. The American army remained segregated. African Americans could serve, but they couldn't lead. It was harmful because they're being told what they're going to do, but they have no power themselves. Whites never wanted to take orders from a black man. In 1948, 3 years after the end of the World War II, the Army was finally not segregated anymore. At one point, Senator Harold Burton writes a response to the NAACP in which he states that there are a lot of federal expenditures due to the Depression. However, this makes African Americans believe their equality is not as worth as much as others. It might have made them feel like the economic status of America is more important than their lives. They want to be a part of the positivity in America. They want to be a part of making and executing policies and even have at least one qualified Negro to the War Labor Board. The president did not see fit to include a Negro in the 12 members of the board, but failed also to include one in the 24 alternates named. This comes from Walter White's piece. He was an NAACP secretary. The war was known to help break some of the racial discrimination because of the necessity it was for the citizens to come together and work together to defeat outside powers. This is where the Double V campaign can be showcased again because of the necessity to bring democracy to America. If you could fight in the war, you were fighting for something that was right. The civil rights movement was underway, though, and African Americans were not going away until they got what they deserved and wanted so dearly. Ethnic Mexican agricultural workers had to battle with many things other ethnic groups had to battle with as well. They were submitted to racial violence, for example. The Zoot Suite riots took place in California in June of 1943. These were conflicts brought upon Mexicans because of their race. World War II soldiers and sailors claimed they were attacked by Pachucos, who were city youths who called themselves Zoot Suites. They arrested many Zoot Suited men, stripping them of their clothes and burning them as well. Police also showed bias against these Mexican Americans, tending to side with these soldiers and sailors. Many of these Zoot Suite men were arrested and either died in prison or were killed. Even though the government passed the Fair Employment Practices Act, eliminating discrimination in employment, nothing was truly stopping the discrimination during this time. This seems to be a recurring pattern. The only reason that Mexican agricultural workers were able to work in America is because there was a labor shortage during the war. The then launched the Bracero program, where braceros, or temporary workers, could come in and farm. However, the oppression was not ending. The American GI Forum, which was created for Mexican Americans to voice their concerns, was furious. A Latino soldier was killed in action fighting for America and for the country, and was originally refused a burial in Texas. Americans needed more soldiers and men working, but did not want to give them the same respect and treatment whites and American citizens were experiencing. This is considered military segregation, as Mexicans were still not allowed to lead, just like African Americans. The labor was also at a low cost for America, so they could underpay these desperate Mexicans that were in need of jobs. Operation Wetback was created to locate and deport undocumented workers. This made Mexicans feel as if the U.S. was using and then abusing them for production and fighting in wartime, and then removal of them post-wartime. They were treated poorly in labor, weren't given fair chances within their jobs, and oppressed violently within society. They contributed to food production and success in the war, just to be beaten down and sent back to their own country. Ethnic Mexicans felt very pressured and unwelcomed. They felt as if they were just a source of labor for the United States and were outcasts as well. The severity of prejudice and discrimination in the United States was overwhelming. To bring this to a close, a huge similarity between the Jewish refugees, African Americans, and ethnic Mexicans was that they were all coming to a society that was unaccepting and unwilling to allow these people to become any more than contributors to the success in the war and success in the country. They were looked down upon and shamed in a place where they were making better. The Mexicans are being used for agricultural labor. The blacks were being stripped of their civil rights through physical violence and fighting in the wars. The Jewish people felt as if they were used as scapegoats for power. And these ethnic groups, they weren't only fighting for their families and personal success, they were fighting for their freedoms and what they deserve. Thank you, and that concludes section assignment 3 for History 1378.